Marianne Howie, and I'd like to welcome you all along with my colleague Bush Weinstein. Both of us are members of the court board. And we're very lucky today to have Dr. Shannon Moffett doing our talk. Her bio is that she graduated with a BFA in theater from NYU, attended Stanford University of Medicine after that. Her postgraduate training was done at Highland Hospital and Alameda Health System in Oakland, California. Following graduation, Dr. Moffett worked in community emergency departments for a year and then moved to Shanghai, China, where she served as the founding director for the United Family Healthcare Emergency Medicine Training Program, a postgraduate fellowship modeled after a U.S.-style EM residency. On returning to the U.S., she took the role of Emergency Medicine Clerkship Director and Director of Undergraduate Medical Education at Rutgers, New Jersey Medical School, University Hospital, Newark, where she is continually trying to up her advising game. What we're going to talk about today, or what Shannon's going to talk about, is what I wish I'd known about advising medical students. And as she prepped us, advising medical students is often the responsibility of the Clerkship Director, Program Director of APDs, but there's rarely formal preparation for this part of the role. And as new situations arise, the wheel can need to be invented again and again. This talk will give a brief framework of what one should know going into the role, how to set up a schedule and advising database to follow both core and visiting students through the application season, and then cover common pitfalls and resources for climbing up out of them. Thank you, Dr. Moffett. We're really happy to have you speaking, and thanks for agreeing to come talk to us.
Hi, everybody. I hope you can hear me. And at some point, I will probably turn off my video so you guys don't see me referring to my notes, but I just wanted everyone to be able to see the face that is presenting the words. So I just wanted to let you all know that I really leaped at the chance to do this talk, and it's not, I must acknowledge, because of any particular expertise, but because I wanted to be part of this conversation, and I wanted to sort of put out a guide there for what I wish I had known. So this is aimed probably at junior faculty who are just taking on an advising role, but I'm very much welcoming comments and additions from people who have more experience in the audience here today. So please let us know. The slides should be easy to follow. They're all pictures. At the very end, I have a little digital handout that I'll present to you that has some of the resources that I talk about. So with that, maybe I'll leave myself up for just a minute. I wanted to basically start out by saying that I watched Mike Gisondi's talk recently, and he was talking about why, about how you should start with the why. And I think it's really important to think about why we do this advising. So I just wanted to briefly mention the fact that every conversation, I think, with your advisees and with people who you're discussing advising should start with an acknowledgement of the extraordinary pressure and high stakes that these kids, young people, are undergoing. And it really needs to be acknowledged along the way, every step of the way. This is the reason I think that we do this role of advising. And I think it's really important to every single time recognize the life-changing nature of this procedure that they're going to. The other thing I think is the reason that we do this is that this is the chance that we have to do some good in the world and increase happiness in the world, which is actually why most of us became doctors in the first place. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing the video and I'm going to just keep on. Please let me know if you have questions along the way. The first part will just be a little going through of my history, and then we'll move on to sort of a month-by-month things that I think you should know and do during the advising soundboard. So I think it's first important to recognize that my history and why I came in so green to this role. As Dr. Howie mentioned, I was first serving, I needed a lot of advice, thus the lifeline here, because I first was working in China before I came here to the United States. So when I first did my interviews, I came in and they asked me a lot of questions about, you know, what my vision for the clerkship director role was, what I saw about undergraduate medical education, and nobody asked a thing. And it was a big surprise to me to learn how much of the advising was a part of this role. This picture is here is to take us back in time a little bit. When I was an undergrad, I thought I was going to be a big movie star. I went to NYU for grad school, or for undergrad, and I was a theater major there. And after that, I waited tables for a long time before my COBRA ran out, and I realized that I needed another career. At that point, I went back to school. I went to an emergency medicine residency, and then I moved to China. And that brings us to the China part of my history. There, I worked for a couple of years and then was asked to start a residency, an EM residency. And these are some of my residents here. And so when I came back to the US, I had a real ticket back into academics. I had definitely done several years of working in education, designing curricula, but I hadn't really done the advising. And my own advising time when I was a student was a little bit of a blur, because at almost this exact time, I had just given birth to my 20-week-old preemie twins. This is them a little bit older. And I very much took for granted the advising that I was given at the time. I think probably the only thing that could distract you from the stress of the advising season is having two 28-week-old twins in the NICU. And I must admit that I completely took for granted this man, Dr. Gesundheit, who was my student advising dean at the time and came to my hospital room when I was on bed rest to finish up my dean's letter and do the last portion of my advising. So it's this kind of goal and this kind of person that I would personally like to be in the medical students' lives. But when I first came back to the US and had this dream of being like Dr. Gesundheit, there were a bunch of gaps in my knowledge. And what I'm going to talk about now is just specifically how I bridged those gaps and what I wish I had known to set up in the very beginning of my time. So starting now, we're going to go month by month through literally what happened to me and what I wish I had done at the time. And the slides are going to get much less interesting for a minute here. I want you to be able to take notes and just sort of listen and think about some of the things that I'm saying. Again, as I refer to references, I'm not going to flash them up on the screen, but at the very end, I'll have a QR code and they should all be available there for you. Okay, so when you come into a new place or take on a new advising role, I think the very first thing that you should do is you should meet with everybody who is part of the advising of those students. And I was naive to this idea, and I didn't really understand how many people that involves. At my school, for instance, we have the Dean of Student Affairs, whoever is serving as the writer of their dean's letter, the Associate Dean for Clinical Education, and then the specific advisors for department or specialty specific, such as myself. It took me a long time to get on the same page with those people. And I would say there's a couple of pitfalls that we came into that I think it's important. You may, even if you have some experience with advising, you may not be aware of these things. In particular, the messaging surrounding your particular specialty, I think, is important. The advisors at my school have been pretty clearly sending out a message that in terms of competitiveness, emergency medicine is in the same group as ophthalmology, dermatology, orthopedics. And while it is competitive, and I do appreciate that the other side of that coin is that you can end up with a lot of candidates who aren't really sure what they want to do, so they just decide on emergency medicine. The fact is that I think there's a lot of candidates out there that are perfect fit for emergency medicine that wouldn't necessarily look competitive on paper in the way the candidates for orthopedics and neurosurgery need to look. And they get missed if the messaging out there is that they can't or shouldn't apply to emergency medicine. So realize when you come into a departmental advising role that there's already been a fair amount of messaging about your specialty, and that you really want to get out there and be part of that conversation and make sure you know what is being said. The other thing that I think you got to do early on is make sure that you know who is going to help you write the slows. This took me by surprise for the first 2 years because it really needs to be done early on so that you get buy-in during the early part of the academic year from those people. So making sure that you understand what the expectations are in your department of who should write your slows and who is going to help you in the advising role. Finally, I think you need to have an honest conversation with whoever else serves an advisory role. If you are the program director, I think you should probably consider finding somebody who isn't the program director to help you. And if you aren't the program director, I think you need to have a real conversation with your program director about what the role is and which roles you're going to take. I personally believe there's a little bit of a conflict of interest in the program director being the advisor, the only advisor for medical students. I think it's nice if they can have somebody who's a little bit removed from the goals of the program, but and can be a true, pure advocate for the student. I am lucky enough to work with Dr. Harsha Sule, who is our program director at Rutgers NJMS, and we have, I think, what might be almost the perfect advising relationship, where I do most of the early stuff, and then as I have questions or as the students approach him, he and I are on like a day-to-day conversational basis so that we can address problems together from our different perspectives. But there are some things that I keep confidential from him, and I think he knows that, and I think the students know that, and I think that's probably the safest for the students, given, again, the stress and high stakes that surround even the smallest of decisions around this time for them. All right. Now, I came in brand new to the institution, brand new to undergraduate medical education in the US, and brand new to advising in April. And I did not realize exactly where I should be on the calendar. So we're going to start with April because that's where I started. But I just wanted to say that probably a couple of the things I'm going to mention should be done late March or planned late March. And this timeline is something that it is not yet up on the site that I'm going to direct you to at the end, but it will be in a matter of hours after this talk goes. So take notes as you want. Realize that this is the type of thing that I now put in my calendar as a yearly repeating thing. So in March or April, I put a reminder to myself that I need to reach out via the student advising deans for the entire school and set up a meeting for all of the EM interested students. I try and cast a broad net and say, if you're even interested, just come on by. And then Dr. Sule, our program director, and I order some pizza and sit down and just have a little chat with the students about what an EM application is going to look like, what they should be doing and thinking, how they should be scheduling themselves, etc. It's a little bit beyond the scope of this talk to specifically discuss what we discussed there, but I will say there's a couple of things that have very recently become less relevant. So one of the things I used to do at this time was to start up a conversation about how the students were going to prepare for the standardized video interview. This was a pretty stressful thing for them, in part because it was new and to us as a specialty and a little bit unclear. It looks to me like that is now going to be irrelevant, and most likely the students will not be required to do a standardized video interview next year. But it's worth making a note there that if there's anything that is early in the application process, that SVI had a deadline of July, which is really quite early. It's important to address it at this time. The other thing that you should probably do at this time is give a shout out to all your slow writers and nail down exactly when you are going to schedule your slow writing meetings. To me, it seemed a little crazy to do this early, But if your department is like mine and you get your clinical schedule quarterly, the fact is that you may be trying to herd cats after a string of nights in a high stress situation in August, unless you get people nailed down specifically for slow writing meetings. One question that comes up at this time is, should you consider writing the slows yourself? I think it's fine to actually write them yourself, and it's kind of nice for all of the slows from one institution to have a similar flavor and a similar tone. But I think most would agree it's a good idea to get a committee together to at least read them. There's certain words that are, for lack of a better word, triggering to some people, and they you may miss them. There's certain things that you may feel about a candidate that may not be widely held opinions. And I think it's fairer to the candidate if there's some kind of input as a group about how your department stands behind this candidate. So that's really all you have to do, is nail down those meetings in April. But if you do, you will definitely thank yourself later. In May, we usually have that meeting with the students and continue to reach out to the emergency medicine interest group and anyone else who has a broad reach within the medical school, to make sure that any EM interested people know that they need to come and meet with us. In June is when most of the students will come and rotate with you. Some of them will come in July. One of the questions that often comes up is when they should take their step one. This, I think, is a little bit of a personal question. Many students want to get their EM clerkship done and then take step one. Some people want to do it the other way. I think it's just important to address it and realize that this feels like an important question to the students. I have not encountered anything that makes any one path clearer than another. That said, at that time is when you actually need to start writing your slows, because you will have already been having at least one set of EM bound students who have done their clerkship. And if you don't start writing the slows, then you are going to run into a backup at the end. Meanwhile, this is the time that Dr. Sule and I sit down and have a meeting with the students and talk about success in a ways. And this is one thing that I think, as we have some conversation afterwards, it would be really nice to talk about. There's certain things that we cover. We cover specifically some big no's, like never miss a shift, do what you need to do to make sure that you're on time always for everything. And we cover a little bit about teamwork and behavior and the expectations clinically of medical students. But the fact is, I think this is something that the students are all really eager for resources on. There's a lot of student-driven resources out there, and I think they do propagate some myths about what is expected and required of the students that add to the stress. And it is one area where I'm sort of interested what other people are doing and how they're preparing their students, who honestly are going out to represent our own institutions out there. The other things that we cover are really just remembering that the social aspects of their away rotation are still going to be very important, and the idea of being always on, and every person that you are talking to is really potentially assessing you and assessing whether they would like to have you at that program. And finally, this I have found to be really important. You need to remind students to bring their suits with them to their away rotations, because not every rotation is clear about whether there will or won't be an interview offered. And it is quite stressful, as you can imagine, to arrive for your big audition away rotation and realize that you don't have a suit and you need to either get yours shipped or buy another one. It's a good time to mention to them that if they don't have a suit, now would be the time to get it. These seem like nitty-gritty things, but I think that there's almost always somebody who hasn't quite come to that level of detail around this time of year. And my experience has been, the more you can talk about these things, the less you end up in sort of these big philosophical conversations that don't quite have an answer yet at this time. Around this time, speaking of philosophical questions, the students will also be wondering how many aways they should do. I have listened enough to the conversations happening on the CORD listserv and at conferences that I'm not sure that I want to necessarily come down hard with an opinion on this, but I will say that at our institution, our students are getting 2 different sets of advice. So we, from the emergency department, we advise them to do 2 rotations, our rotation and 1 away, unless they have a big question they want to answer, or they're aiming to go into a completely geographically different area. So we're on the East Coast. If I have a candidate who wants to match potentially on the West Coast, I usually recommend that they do both an away in our regional area and an away in the target area. Even that can be controversial. Our deans for student affairs and the other advising staff at the medical school, understandably, I think, are concerned that this would put our students at a disadvantage, and they seem to be advising them to do more aways than that. I have heard at least that they put out at least 2 aways, which would be terrible, I think, for us as a specialty if everybody had to do at least 2 aways. But that is a conversation, and if you are new to advising, as I was, it certainly took me by surprise, and I didn't really understand all of the drivers behind the advice that goes on that. So just be aware that that's a question, and be aware that even different people with experience will have different answers for that question. All right, moving on to July. July is when many of you will have visiting rotators as well, and you will also still be advising your students. Some of them will be doing away rotations. This is the time where you should make sure that all the students have an easy way to access you, but also make sure that that way to access you fits with your boundaries, or that you've provided clear boundaries. I have definitely gotten texts from students in the wee hours of the morning. This is fine by me. I have been clear that this is fine. It's hard for them to know my schedule, but if that's going to bother you, you should be quite clear when you do give them your contact information, how you would prefer to be contacted. The biggest thing I get contacted about at this time is a missed shift, or being late to a shift, or some feedback that struck the students on their away rotation being potentially damaging to them. This is another interesting conversation that has come up recently, the conversation of whether a student should ever not release a SLO from a particular program. I personally come down on the side of you should release it all, because it looks worse to not have one. But I think it's a real conversation. It's a real source of stress for the students. And I do think that it's important to take it seriously and to be ready for an amount of dismay on the part of the students that you hadn't really expected. I do not tend to get involved directly with the program directors or the clerkship directors at the other sites. In general, it has sufficed to tell the students, this is probably going to be fine. You may be overreacting. And I will say parenthetically that they definitely have been overreacting, at least at times for me. There's people who have gotten their absolute first choice, even matched at the place where they thought they were getting this damaging feedback. So they're most likely overreacting. If it's something clear like a missed shift, you will probably need to talk them through owning up to it, apologizing, and not groveling, and that will be it. But you should realize that unfortunately July is not the greatest time to take, if you're going to be in an advising role, July and August are not the greatest times to take like a camping trip where you won't have cell service, unless you've clearly handed off that advising role to somebody else during that time. All right, moving on to August. August, thank goodness, is really basically just July again. And so you just need to be working through your SLOs, because in your perfect world, and many of us do not meet this perfect world, but in your perfect world, you are going to be submitting all of the SLOs that you have written for everybody who has already rotated with you by ideally September 15th. The first year that I did this, our SLOs did not go out until October 15th. And I think that that is fine. That is fine. I don't think anybody really suffered from that, other than the candidates and me, because the candidates were getting increasingly worried, and and I was getting essentially daily emails saying, when do you think they're going to be up? When do you think they're going to be up? So realistically, October 1st is probably most of our goals, but if you can make a September 15th goal for most of them, then your students will be happier and you will be happier, and things will feel calmer and more controlled, which is what we should be aiming for our students, I think. I did want to mention a couple of things about the SLO process for anybody listening who hasn't done it yet. There are some things that, at least in my experience, took a lot longer than I expected. I'm curious to see what other people think about it. There's a nice process set up, and I have links in the thing I'm going to hand you out at the end on specifically where you go to create the PDF that you will later upload to a completely different system. This becomes second nature once you have done it for a couple of years. But as walking in the door, I had never seen any of these places before, and there's not really one clear place that I had been directed to go to find all of this information. Once you know it, but just realize that there are two different places that you'll need to go, and also that the system takes a little bit longer than you would expect it to if you are persnickety, and most of us are. For some reason, the PDFs that get created on the eSLO system, which is accessed by Cord, tend to reinterpret some of, in particular, the Microsoft Word characters as nonsense characters. And so you can go through the entire process of getting your group together, gathering your evaluations, writing your SLOs, and then try and be creating this PDF, and you can end up having to do it 5 or 6 times just to get rid of the characters. There are workarounds. I'm interested to hear other workarounds that other people have, or if they've had this experience, but it does take a little bit more time than you would expect. Another thing I will mention, as I'm mentioning SLOs, is that the setting up an advising database at the very beginning of your advising time, so somewhere around May when you meet those students, is a great idea, and it will help you a lot later. I have on the handout that I'm going to give you at the end, I have a downloadable sample format for the advising database. Many of you may already have a similar thing, but to broadly outline it, you want to make sure that you have your names, emails, and contact information for every student that you got the minute they come into your sphere, and that you start taking notes on them, specifically on their grades and USMLE scores. Eventually, when you get visiting students, you also want to make sure you ask them up front what number rotation it is and log when they rotate with you. This is the type of thing that takes an organized and detail-oriented person to do in the midst of everything else, but it is such a blessing when you sit down to write your SLOs and you have everything in place. The other thing I recommend, and again, this is in the document that you'll be able to access at the end, the other thing I recommend is that you put the SLO bubbles in columns in your database, so that you can make decisions as a group without having to fill out the SLOs. And that will become a little more clear if you take a look at it. We can pull it up afterwards if there's questions regarding that. But it does require just a little bit of setup in the beginning that you'll be very grateful for around September and October, when you're under the gun and trying to get these SLOs uploaded. All right, moving on to October, which is not much different than September, although your department will probably be ramping up for interviews at this time. And so just in terms of pitfalls, my experience was that was when the the PDs and APDs sort of ceased having as much time to write SLOs or deal with medical students at all. So be aware, if you still have visiting students at that time, that your students are going to, you're going to need to really advocate for them to get good SLOs at that time. The students that you're advising, they are now starting to get their interviews. And I usually send an email in somewhere between October 15th or October 20th, specifically to them saying, how many interviews do you have at this time? And I take a little snapshot of that. It's a little early to do that in some ways because many of them will get more interview offers at that time. But it is, I think, almost a little bit late to identify a candidate that may be a problem candidate. This is where I wanted to talk a little bit about the problem candidates. Ideally, you will have identified them early on by talking to the advising staff and by your own review of their grades and scores. But you may realize that there was something that you didn't know about. Perhaps it's something in one of the SLOs from their aways. And a pretty good thermometer there is how many interviews your students have at this point. I currently have a range from the very concerning 3 at this point to the overkill 28 to 30 at this point. And you really need to do some advising, some active advising on both ends of the spectrum at this point. You need to talk to your students who have few interviews and see if you can figure out why. Hopefully you'll have a sense for why, but it's regardless of why, it's time to take some action and try and perhaps widen their strategy so that maybe they apply to some newer programs, some less competitive programs. And it's not too late to do that at this time. Possibly discuss letters of interest. This is another hot topic that people, it's a real challenge as a student advisor to deal with, because we do know that the people giving out these interviews are human, and that a well-timed and appropriate interaction might actually swing the balance towards offering a student an interview. On the other hand, I think Madonna Fernandez just sent out an email to the entire community saying that her inbox had 80 letters of interest that were clearly just basically spammed out from these students, and that is not helpful and is really not nice to your colleagues. It's a time when, if you have any connections and pull, or if your PDs do, it's time to start advocating for these students if you believe that they would be a good fit at a particular program. I'm going to talk a little bit about the end, about what you want to do early on with these more difficult to place candidates and why they might be difficult to place. But just realize that October is your time to really find out if that advising that you did what it needed to do, or if you need to do some more advocacy for those students. So come November, you hopefully are continuing to advocate, continuing to get interviews. It's the time when some of your students with the more offers are going to start coming to you asking what they can drop. And if they aren't, you should be reaching out to them and saying, hey, maybe you could drop some of these interviews. Nobody needs to go, in my opinion, on X number of interviews, whatever X is. Somewhere above 20 to me is probably too many. I think some people might move the mark to 15. Some people might move it to 30. But there's a point where the expense and exhaustion really shouldn't be undertaken by the students, and they should give some of those interviews to people who need them. Strategically doing that and doing that in a polite way is something that a lot of students need help with. Unfortunately, it's not always the students who recognize that they need help. So reaching out to them early is probably good. And then once you identify some who have 20 plus, just have a little conversation with them as well, saying, well, what would you be able to cut, and helping them strategize a little bit. I had just such a conversation yesterday, and honestly, I think it's a great relief for the students, and it allows you to know that you're freeing up some of these interviews so that other people can get a chance to get in the door. And then we are at December, which is like the 1 month that you get a chance to breathe a little bit. Most most places are still interviewing, but people's interview schedules are really relatively set. And I just want to breeze through January and February and mention that those are the months when the next year's class are probably going to start contacting you. I usually try and put them off until after match, but it's really time to start that database and start again for the next year. Um, that said, January, depending on how your schedule works, may be the time when you need to be filling in your clinical schedule. Please, please, please don't make the mistake that I did and don't schedule yourself to work clinically on the days of no match Monday and on match day itself. Those are days where you're probably going to need to devote yourself to providing some emotional support and really some mechanical support as well. Certainly No Match Monday is a day when you and the advising staff at your medical school, if you're unlucky enough to have somebody not match, you're going to need to work together to try and help and develop a strategy. And you're going to need to be using all the resources that you have to help advocate for that student if you feel it is appropriate. And honestly, if you have supported a student through this time and they haven't matched, it probably is, behooves us, I think, to help them at this time. I have had one student who didn't match so far. I haven't been doing this very long. I have had one student who didn't match, and I do think it was because of a failure on my part to communicate, and potentially a failure on that student's part to hear me about what strategy they should use. But it does, you do need to be available to help work through that particular problem on that day. And then on match day itself, there will be people who are really thrilled and want to come by and say hi to you, and there will be people who are really unhappy and want to come by and say hi to you and go through how can this have happened. I learned in the first year to keep tissue at my desk, and I also learned that it's pretty important to separate the celebrators from the grievers. It's also probably a good time to ponder what you want your role in the ranking and match list to be. For the first year, I really wanted to be part of it, and I think I learned a lot from it. But since then, I have pulled back a little bit from being a strong participant in the ranking and match list, because I think it's hard to be a true, honest shoulder to cry on for your students if you were really party to all the conversations about about why they didn't match at your own institution, which can happen. I'm also sort of curious how other people manage that particular issue, because it can be rough for somebody to not match at your institution when they really felt a sense of ownership and when you've been working with them for this whole time. And then it's April, and it is time to do it again and start again. This is when I'm going to stop and open it up for conversation. I do want to, as part of that conversation, if you guys scan this QR code, if you don't know how to do that, I can talk you through it. If you scan this QR code, it should take you to a place where there's links to a bunch of different resources. In particular, my favorite of them is the very recent Council of Residency Directors / EMRA student applying guide, which has essentially all the data that you could ask for on what numbers you need to get in order to be pretty sure that you're going to match, and various different strategies that can be used. A group that I'm involved in, it's called CORD ASCM, which is advising Students Committee for Emergency Medicine, I think. They have a number of resources, and they are all linked to on that page. The one that I have used the most is the Advising Consult Service, which is something that I think is just an amazing, amazing thing, where basically as an advisor, you can send a question. Listen, I've got this student and this happened, X, Y, or Z. What would you guys think I should counsel them to do about it, or what should we do about it? And it's a way to get a voice from somebody outside your institution, so you're not sort of outing that student if it's a problem to your program directors. and they have a group there who sort of compare notes, and you get a bunch of feedback from them. It's probably underutilized, but it is really, really, it has been really valuable every time I've used it. The same group, that Ask 'em group, also has done a series of advising guides for specific populations. Those are also linked on one of the pages there. So they have a specific advising guide for DOs, for international medical grads, for people couples matching, for the military match. These are honestly many of these are things I hadn't even heard of or thought about when I came into the role. And if I had known that these things existed, I think I would have been a better advisor to my students at that time. All right, I am going to turn my video back on if I can figure out how to do that. And that's me and my Twitter if you need to. And then maybe we can take a few minutes for questions, if anybody has any.
Hey there, I have a question.
Sure.
My name is Lauren Sigmund. I'm an education fellow at OHSU, and I'm also serving as the assistant clerkship director here. So I'm also new to the role.
Hi.
Hey, I just had a question about something that you said earlier on in the talk. So you were mentioning that you make like kind of a big spreadsheet or a database that has all of the information for the different students that you're advising, and that you use that when you're writing the slows.
Yeah.
I was kind of under the impression that the slow is meant to be more just based on their clinical, or sort of during their performance during that clerkship, and not necessarily supposed to take into account things outside the clerkship, like their test scores and stuff like that. Is that true?
That is a good question, and I should clarify. So I use the same file for everything, but the early on information that I collect is really just to strategize with them. So if somebody comes in and their step 1 was 250 and their step 2 was whatever the highest score is, and they were a scribe and they were a medic and they've gotten all honors, I want to sort of know that as we're trying to figure out where they should do their OAs, and then as we're figuring out their application strategy. But I do not include that at all in their SLO. What I do have a field for, and I am lucky enough to have a fantastic clerkship coordinator, and what I do have a field for is basically all the text comments that were written about that student during their clerkship, and those eventually I put the document up onto a OneDrive, and then she just like types and pastes in all of those comments. And then when we have our meetings, we look at the evaluations, we look at those comments, and we craft the SLO and fill in the bubble. So we craft the actual SLO text and fill in the bubbles based on only those things. So although I have the same file, you're absolutely right. And I never mention that stuff. I think we're all pretty clear that anything that can be on their transcript or their CV shouldn't be part of the SLO text.
Okay, cool. I just wanted to make sure.
No, it's a good point.
Hi, this is Moshe Weitzberg. First of all, thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation. I loved how you organized it by month, and it was very all-encompassing. And just another comment before a question. I think as a specialty, we need to be really proud of this. We as a specialty, I think, put in a tremendous amount of time and effort into guiding our students and helping them to match in emergency medicine. And I hope they appreciate it. And I think as a specialty, we should be really proud of what we do. Now, my question is this. You mentioned that you have some students who have a small number of interviews. And I'm facing a student who has a very similar situation and also only 3 interviews. And after going through their application, I don't know why. I don't see any clear red flags. I don't know what's limiting them. They happen to be an osteopathic student. I don't know if that's playing into it, but they literally have what I would consider an average, maybe a little bit above average board scores. And their slows, or what I call middle slows, everything part B is straight down the middle. So I consider that an average letter, and yet they're not getting interviews. So my question is, are you seeing that more this year, that students are not getting as many interviews as you would have expected in the past? And I'm curious what other people on the call are seeing as well.
Yeah, I am really curious about that too. I have to admit that my student sounds almost exactly the same as yours. I expected them to be on the lower end, but I did not expect it to be this low at this time. And I think there's 2 dangers. One is the students who are sort of middle of the road are not going to necessarily be in the first round. They are going to be the ones who get the canceled slots later. So I think we all, the students and probably ourselves, need to take a little breath this early, and realize that few interviews now may not be as quote unquote bad as it looks. I do think that, so I'm very interested to hear what other people say, and so I probably should keep this short because I want to hear. I do think that the DO thing is a little bit of a ding in some populations, and so it may have depended a little bit where they applied. And then finally, I'm very interested in this conversation that we all seem to keep having about what the middle means, because we are all so loath to put the lower end of anything because we think we have like slow-pedoed them, which means does then that middle just become the low end? And so we now have dinged them by doing that. And I think we all need to admit our parts, us included, need to admit our parts in that sort of great inflation thing. But I'm so curious what anybody else has to say about this year in particular, or anything else on this topic. Marianne, I think you're muted. I don't hear you. Do you hear me?
Marianne, we can't hear you. I'm not sure why you're.
So Tina, I don't think I'm able to see the.
Uh-oh. We're having some tech difficulties. Marianne, I think she jumped off. She'll probably just jump back on. There are no questions in the chat box for now, but Melissa has her hand up. I'm going to unmute you, Melissa, and you can ask your question. Melissa, Jancy?
Melissa, can you hear me?
Okay. Does anybody else have a question? If you want to type in the chat box. Seems like we might have a sound issue. Let's see, here comes Marianne. Sorry about this, everybody.
I've got another quick question while we kind of try to figure out the audio.
Sure.
So this is Lauren Sigmund again. Quite a question we got from a lot of applicants this year is kind of what is like a quote safe number of interviews for them to have, like how many interviews do they need to have a pretty good chance of ranking or of matching rather. What is your answer to that question?
Yeah, so I am so happy. I realized that I should probably put the QR code thing back up again so that people can use it if they want. I am so happy, and I have no stock in this and I had no part in creating it, but this Cord EMRA Student Advising Guide actually addresses that at length, in addition to a number of other data-based answers to questions. The short answer is 12. 12 is how many they need to have in order to get, be pretty sure, like 98% or something of, or maybe 100% of matching. So I don't know, somewhere around 12. I mean, that seems, you put out a number like that to students and then they start freaking out if they have 11, or resting calmly if they have 13, but they're all at super crazy competitive places because they didn't do a broad enough base strategy. But for your knowledge and ballparking, 12 seems to be the answer to that.
Hey, Shannon, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yay!
Yay!
So I want to follow up on the osteopathic side of things because it was a little interesting to me as an allopath that had come from a primarily allopathic place for a very long period of time. I came over and I became the program director here at Barnabas. And I was finding osteopathic students not doing 1 or 2 away electives, but doing 5 away electives. Now, how much of that is for this perceived ding, and how much of it is the neuroses of the med schools just trying to get their students to be as competitive as possible? I'm not really sure, but it certainly seems overwhelming. right, to do 5 EM electives in your last year just seems like it's an enormous amount of a combination of pressure and kind of doing what you're going to do the rest of your life anyway. So wouldn't it be nice to diversify a little bit before that? So I'd be interested to hear from anyone who has other thoughts along those lines about, because I tried to come up with the idea that, hey, how about you just two away electives? And it was like I was talking like I was the devil.
So somebody else please jump in, but I do want to say that I am disappointed to report that I know firsthand that at least at some places, there is, at least now, a perception that, I don't know, a subtle ding against DOs, I would say. And I don't know what I don't know, and I would love to see data on, is how widespread that is, or even just hear anybody else's thought about it. But again, even if they're not DOs, you do end up in this situation where for an individual student, it's possible at least that doing a bunch of aways would be better for them. I usually try and emphasize the fact that, as you said, Marianne, yeah, you could go do something else, like demonstrate your interest and learn some skills. Don't just do the same thing. And then I also just try and say, you're going to be burned out. You can be burned out before you start. Like, why would you do that to yourself? But I think, and at 5, I think we could probably all agree is ridiculous, but I'm not sure where the right number is. And I actually don't know if that guide has data on that, but it would be really interesting to see, like, does it actually increase your chances of either matching or matching at your first choice? Anybody else?
Yes, there is a question. So it's from Melissa Jancy, and she said, I have found the same dilemma this year that I have quote unquote middle of the road candidates that have reasonable slows and scores, no red flags, but only 3 to 4 interviews to date. I am unsure how to advise, and prior to this was not worried about them matching.
So, okay. So I will say this. First of all, a reminder to everybody, it is still a little bit early. I do believe that they will get more interviews as the season goes on. We're at like first round and second round around this time. It's just, I think it's time to check in. It's not necessarily time to panic for anybody, advisors or advisees. That said, I have found that I've been able to sort of plump up that number, and you can't really do a controlled experiment and find out if it would have plumped up anyway, by a strategy that goes a little bit like this. I personally, if I think the candidate is a good fit for anyone, anywhere that I have any connections, I reach out to them respectfully and say, listen, if you have any slots, I think this person would be a good fit. Do you think you can squeeze them in? I also, and this is controversial, but I recommend that the students send a couple of letters of interest, not a blanketed one and not a form letter. I tell them, pick a couple places you really wish you could go and you have a reason for it, and then send them one respectful email saying, this is what I would like, this is why I wanted to come there and was interested in your program. If you had any spots, I'd be extremely happy to take them. I don't know, if that, I'm not sure how that plays. I am mindful of filling everybody's inbox, but I'm also mindful of the fact that as people start to cancel, you have these slots and you're not sure who's going to say yes. It's a little bit of a logistical nightmare. And if you have somebody who is next-ish on your list and they've expressed an interest, I think it's probably likely that they might actually get the slot. Finally, I think it's time, I think it is helpful to start checking off some other programs and submitting to those programs. Sometimes there's a place that they just were kind of not interested in because it was a little bit far from their family or whatever, and then submitting an application to that can help. And then there are these new programs. This year, there's actually quite a number of new programs that some of which weren't even accredited quickly enough to participate in the match, but sending an application to them at this time gives a little bit of a safety net, and sort of broadening the strategy a little bit has worked for me. So I think it also gives the candidates something to do at this time, because it is so stressful to sit there waiting for these things to come in, not knowing if they're going to, and having this feeling of powerlessness. So I try and make some steps for all of us to do so that we feel like we're doing something while also not harassing others. Anybody else have a strategy or thoughts on this?
No comments on that part, but there is another question from Marianne. How do you keep yourself fresh in the advising role? It can be both high stakes and high emotion for those of you who are advising. How do you help yourself keep balance so that there can be longevity in the role? Or do you think this role has a timestamp?
Oh, that's a good question. So personally, I think that it should have longevity and could have longevity. I actually think it's one of the, I mean, part of the reason I got involved with the Ask 'em group and agreed to do this talk is that I have found it to be actually one of the most interesting things I'm doing, because there isn't as much data and it isn't as clearly defined of a role. And it is super high stakes for the students. So I actually think there's definitely longevity, and some of it really depends on your understanding of the conversations that are happening and the trends that are occurring. And that needs to happen kind of, you need to sort of have your finger on the pulse of what's happening within the specialty all the time. So it's kind of a way to do that, and talk to your colleagues nationally. And so I find that part really, really interesting. I didn't mention this in the talk, but one of the things I do think is important is realizing that you yourself are sometimes, depending on your role, being judged a little bit by who matches and who doesn't, which can, or where they match, which can end up being pretty stressful professionally. So there is like a fair amount of stress on you personally, in addition, if you're the type who responds to other people's stress, it can be frustrating. So I would say that a few of the strategies, one of the reasons that I developed this sort of database that I have in the system, and I put in my calendar reminders and everything, is that I personally am trying to make sure that I am ahead of the game always, and that before the candidates even know they have a question, I have answered it for them. I think that helps a lot if you don't also feel a little bit behind or under the gun. The other thing is talking to your other advisors and developing a strategy. I do have a couple of candidates who are double applying in another specialty. And I think, although it's a little more work up front, it takes some of the stress of like, will I match, off of it, so we can start talking more about the happy dream of being an emergency physician. I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts on that, but I think it's a great question. I personally think it's better if you stay longer, because you're going to learn more and more and be a better resource for the students.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions? Was that somebody? Sorry, go ahead.
That was me. I was just about to ask if anybody else had any questions. If no one else has any questions, I really want to thank Dr. Moffat for an amazing talk. It is obviously incredibly well timed, given both the questions about where people are with their advising and all the calendar that we're looking at now. I really enjoyed the organization as well. I know that that Dr. Weisberg said the same thing. But thank you very much, and I'm very glad you're able to do this. I do want to point out that we are going to be doing Cord Connects next month again. We'll have Jan Schoenberger talking about leadership and leadership styles. So we'd love to have everybody join us again. Any other questions or comments?
Thank you so much. I just wanted to say, feel free, if you're not on Twitter, I'll throw my email up on the same thing that this leads to, where you can find me. And I'd love to talk to anybody about this, because I've really become interested in it.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much. That was really, really good.
Oh, thanks, you guys. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.